Right. So why is there a problem? Josh, you want to take a stab at that? Why is privacy a problem?
Well, the major asset of the current era is data, and the companies derive value from that data. So there's sort of a trade-off. They exist and they make so much money because people provide them with all the personal information they can consume and information they don't even know they're giving the big companies. So yes, that what you have right there is sums it up great. It's data is basically equivalent to money and power.
So what is a EULA and how does that relate to the question of data, power, and money?
It's the end user license agreement,
Yep.
asking people to basically sign away all of their rights against a billion or trillion dollar company with a legal department on the other end. So it's not a fair agreement really, between powerless user and large corporation to basically get rid of your rights in order to use their service that they're providing for you.
True, but is this really a question of fairness, or is there a deeper question?
I would say the fairness question is one of many that comes up here. There definitely is an aspect of fairness, but it's not the only problem.
Okay, what's your take on all this? Do you see a different problem than fairness?
It's just kind of back and forth for me because, like you said, you're basically like giving up some of your like information so you can be like better served, I guess. Like especially like when you have like privacy agreements, or they're like, let us have access to this so we can give you ads or things that are tailored to your specific interest. And then at the same time, they're getting this information and we don't know what they're doing with it once they get it. Like they can tell you like, oh, we're not gonna, do this and do this, but in reality, you're not really sure what is done with that information, what they get when they get it.
Yes, two of the most common reasons they want your data is the first excuse is user experience. The more we know about you, the higher the quality of the experience. So if you put this in Google's terms, they're going to say that they can better tailor the experience by knowing more data about you. That's the basic argument from this first point. And they'll typically say, you don't need to know you're not bothered with any extraneous, unneeded information. That's exactly what you need, exactly when you need it. Another phrase they like to use with this is more relevant information. Make sense?
Yeah, I also think it's like funny. Well, not funny, but like weird how like even when you don't sign up for like those user agreements with certain apps, you still get those like tailored advertisement. Like if you Google something, you you start seeing ads for it like on Instagram and things like that when you haven't even given them your information. So like, like that information is kind of circling around somehow.
Well, there's a legal term called implied consent. Implied consent means your actions imply that you have given your consent. You don't have to actively, every single time, give your consent. So, for example, if you accept Google's policy on data, in their EULA, then anyone who has an agreement with Google can use your data. That's basically the argument. It also applies if you click on accept and you haven't read all the terms of the EULA. They're going to argue that you gave your consent even if you didn't read it. So once that has occurred, there's basically no limit on what they're going to do. Make sense?
And that makes more sense, like now that I'm thinking about it.
Mm-hmm. It's also the case, by the way, if you take, for example, Google as a search engine. Google, in effect, is a kind of broker between you and a retailer. Another word for the EULA, by the way, is terms and conditions. In which case, because you have consented to Google and the retailer has consented to Google, Google becomes a kind of data broker in between. Make sense? Yes, no?
Yes,
What, is this getting really complex really fast?
a little bit, but like I understand it.
Oh, well, think of it this way. You know how, let's try real estate. I list your house. That is to say, you give me the right to sell your house. I find a buyer for your house. I'm the middleman. I'm the broker in the deal. I have a two-way agreement. That person who wants to buy your house can't go around me. And you can't go around me either. And by doing that, I give myself a sizable amount of control. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay. Josh, any questions so far?
No.
Okay. Another part of this comes down to payment of for service. You agree to give Google personal data in exchange for the use of their technology. And unless you're a sophisticated user, the goal is to get you to think about it as free. Make sense? Yes, no?
Yes.
That makes sense, especially like because I never actually like paid to use Google, but like you pay for like other things related, I guess.
Well,
So
put it in a different context. I spend a tremendous amount of money on research and development. I need to have what is referred to as an ROI, a return on investment. I can't spend a lot of money on R&D without making money back. So I have a limited number of choices. So this becomes a line of argument. Pay me or give me something of equal value. Do you see a potential problem there?
Well, users are sort of um, naive marketers of their own data. They don't know what it's worth, and generally speaking, they don't know how it's used. Um, so it to a user, it's just choosing between a free service and a paid service, and they don't really understand the difference there. So they're funneled into the free services for the most part.
Yeah, except the reality of the matter is that it may not be of equal value. That in the end, the data that Google has collected is far more valuable than the technology and the research and development. Right?
and that's what I was kind of thinking about. Like you can't really put a price on someone's like personal data.
Well, you can't, but a price is being put when Google sells it.
I mean, like physically. I mean, like physically, you can, but like when you really
Right.
think about it,
That part is true.
it's kind of like when you're like, "Oh, my parents have, done all of this. I'm gonna pay them back," but you really don't know like what physical number that would be.
Yeah. And what do these companies argue?
Like you're paying them, and they tell you like where like your family is from, which is kind of
They do, but they argue that number one, that they don't include any personal data. The phrase is that the data has been scrubbed, cleaned of personal data. It would cost more if they didn't sell it. The test would cost more. Recent articles suggest that both of these are false. It took a team of 25 scientists less than an afternoon to take a so-called anonymous piece of data and track down the likely location of the owner. Not to the street, but close enough to prove that your data is really never anonymous. And the argument that it would cost more, well, I'm not sure how you prove that when you consider the billions of dollars that these companies are making. And they are on your data. Is this making sense?
and that makes sense.
Okay. Josh is our token hardcore programmer. What do you think?
Yeah, that's kind of the point I was trying to get across. The people selling the data, the users, have no idea what it's worth, and they don't know what it's worth to the companies, or to the people buying their data. So it's not a fully consensual trade, I guess you could say, since it's uninformed. But yeah, all this makes sense so far.
Yep. Well, most of the time the argument will be made that uninformed consent is still consent. If you go for an operation, in some shape or form, you're going to be giving uninformed consent because you can't possibly begin to understand the complexity of what's about to be done to you, right? Yeah.
At least in that case, you are sitting down with well, at least I hope you're sitting down with a medical professional to talk it through. In the tech space, you're just given a long document that generally no one reads. That's the and that the long document doesn't really specify everything that they're going to do with it, just that they could do certain things. So it's a bit more hidden even than the medical case.
Well, the answer is probably, and you're also going to run into when you get a job in your contract, if you are lucky enough to get a contract. Yeah. Which basically means they can tell you to do whatever they want to tell you to do. Right? Yep. Whatever they decide, you're going to do. But underneath this, there's another problem. Any ideas what that might be?
Like if they tell you to do something that's not exactly in your job description or kind of like outside of that realm of like work that they initially told you you're going to be doing, you can't really like challenge that because you're like, they, you know, you signed it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, let's go back to privacy. Do we in this country have a right to privacy?
To an extent, yes, but not really.
It's very piecemeal. It's like there are certain specific protections for some health information, but there's no general guidelines that I'm aware of, at least, for privacy in general.
Yeah, HEPA guarantees some privacy of your health records. But outside of something like HEPA, do we have a right to privacy?
I think there might be some case law on you have the right to privacy physically in your own home, but that sort of precedent doesn't tell us anything about uh, internet interactions or technology.
The concept of probable cause becomes extremely important. What is probable cause and why would it become important?
On like a legal standpoint, like if they have probable cause, then they can like search your house or like your car or like anything like that.
Yeah, probable cause says if you have sufficient reason to suspect a crime has been or will be committed, you can get a warrant to search.
Excuse me. In general, is that not specifically a limitation on state power and doesn't really so much apply to private individual to private individual or private organization to private individual?
Well, that's where things get extremely vague. And even in the case of the state versus the individual, what constitutes sufficient reason? And there are situations, for example, do you know what the Patriot Act was?
Yeah, we were actually talking about that in my American British literature because we were on the 9/11 and post 9/11 topic, which was a huge mess because they had that whole see something, say something. So they just suspected anybody and everybody without a specific reason, which caused like a bunch of Muslim people and brown people in general to be arrested or deported without probable cause.
Yes. In extreme situations involving national security. Then your civil rights are suspended and probable cause does not apply. So if you think about it, there is no absolute guarantee to a right to privacy. None. It's contingent on there not being a potential violation of national security. Am I making sense? Yes, no?
Yes, and I'd like to point out too that it opened the door for the dragnet policies, that there wasn't even really a national security interest in a lot of that data collection. It was just, we'll collect everything and we'll dig through it and find stuff that we might want to investigate.
Yeah, and in fact, the NSA is still monitoring phone calls. And it has software that scans essentially digitized recordings. Well, our phones are digital, so it's kind of irrelevant. It scans the digital calls looking for keywords. And those that contain the keywords are sent to analysts who then listen to the entire message. Again, in theory, because this is supposed to be blind, they don't know who you are unless they deem there is sufficient reason to further investigate that there is no real violation of your privacy. In theory. In theory. So what does this tell us about civil rights?
It seems almost like an illusion of civil rights, like they exist in principle, but with all of the exceptions and backdoors and dragnet policies and everything, and with the state being the one who gets to define when the state can do something, it's sort of like a right in name only. It doesn't necessarily really exist.
Okay, well, you're on the right track. Think about the phrase,
Civil privileges, is that what you're going for?
no, I'm going for the fact that this is, in fact, arguing that all rights are a subset of the social contract. That there are no human rights outside the social contract. None. If you put this in terms of our conversation earlier in the semester, as long as the human question remains unanswered, then there's no definition of human rights. It comes up in this week on the UN's Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And we've talked about this in the past. Every country in the world and that's a bit of an exaggeration, but virtually every country in the world has signed it, including the United States. But how many of them honor it? We surely don't. In the extreme, neither do Russia or China. So, this is essentially a pointless document. Whatever rights you have are shaped by the social contract. And in terms of the United States, so we have a right to privacy only insofar as it is determined by the social contract. And the downside of the social contract is profound. Think about it. In our Constitution, 5 people of color are equal to 3 white people. So, by definition, a social contract can potentially be highly restrictive. In its application of rights. It can also revoke them at any time. You know what happened during World War II in this country?
The Japanese internment camps.
There you go. We revoked their civil rights and we put them in internment camps. And if you think about this debate, in most states, if you're a felon, you can't vote. In some states, you have highly restrictive civil rights if you're a felon. And there's nothing you can do about it. Nothing. So this idea that we have an unrevocable right to privacy is not true. The phrase that's often used we talk about 2 types of rights. The reality of the matter is that as long as your rights are determined by the social contract, all rights are alienable. For example, we have the right to property. But we also have what is eminent domain?
The state's right to extend their reach onto your property for, or take your property for some public work, like a road or a rail line or something like that. Yes, a common good. That's a good way to put it.
Yeah. And the way it works is they will make, quote, a reasonable offer, unquote. If you don't accept that reasonable offer, then they will make you what they consider to be a fair offer. If you don't accept their fair offer, they condemn your property. Which means they can take it for nothing. So when you think about privacy within this context, it's really difficult to argue not only that privacy is a right, but exactly what it means to be private. You see my point? Yes, no?
Yes.
Yes.
Is this making sense?
Yeah, it makes sense.
And what's your reaction to it?
Um, I don't know. It makes sense, but I don't know.
Okay. The other part of the puzzle here that's difficult coming from England, our legal system thinks in terms of redress, which is fixing a harm, and tort, which is the harm. So if my taking your data doesn't result in a tangible, quantifiable harm, if you can't prove that my collecting information about you is harming you, there's no redress. Am I making sense?
Yeah, that makes a lot more sense.
Mm-hmm.
So does it kind of go back to like what we kind of talked about at the beginning of the semester? Like if you can't prove that what I'm doing is hurting you, then you really can't say anything about it.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah. Mhm. And part of the problem with privacy is rooted in old technology. Well, what do I mean? Well, when you're using a modem, modulator, demodulator, you're sending data over what used to be an analog phone line. Using a form of communication called serial, which essentially sent one bit at a time until one byte was formed. And the speed of a modem is measured in baud. 19.2K baud was not even remotely close to 1 gig. So when we moved to graphical user interfaces, for example, services called Prodigy and AOL, you would dial the phone, your modem would respond to their modem, and you would literally watch a line of the screen be drawn at a time until the entire screen was drawn. So the initial design or the original point of a cookie so rather than retrieve all of the information about the screen from a file server located on the end of a very slow phone line on the other side of the country, I could leave critical information about that screen configuration directly on your machine. And that is initially what the purpose of a cookie was. Over time, it expanded to be personalized. And over time, the more it has become personalized, the more information you're essentially leaving behind. There was no conversation when cookies began to arrive on the scene about the fact that they would be harvested. Well, if you know where they are, if you know where they're stored, retrieving that data, retrieving that cookie is real easy to do. Yeah.
So basically, like when we go onto a website and we're like in there, like this website uses cookies, do you want to accept them or things like that? They basically just have like access to like everything, essentially.
Well, it depends on where your server is being hosted. For example, in Canada, a series of laws called ICANN, there might be two ends, I'll have to check, govern everything from spam whether you by default opt in or opt out, to potentially customizing cookies. In theory, you're supposed to be able to say, sure, do this, but not this. So go ahead, leave information about the user interface, but don't track any of my personal information. And that's why increasingly people are using VPNs as a kind of screen to make it harder for companies to collect and track your data. Make sense?
And that one makes a lot more sense because I've always like heard people use like or like say use VPN so they won't be able to like track you or things like that. But I never really understood like what they meant. So this makes a lot more sense.
Yeah, but also keep in mind that you have alternatives. For example, I have 2 email accounts. I have one under a pseudonym. You know what a pseudonym is?
Yes.
Okay. And then I've got my real one. My pseudonym has a completely different birth date, a completely different location. So in theory, if you're picking up data from that email account, it's going to be completely wrong. And as a consequence of that, I'm protected. Am I making sense?
Yes. That
Mhm.
makes sense.
I also make a decision about what I'm going to do online and what I'm not. For example,
So wouldn't they be able to like still get the information from like your real account? Wouldn't that kind of defeat the purpose? Or are there certain things that like you differentiate between the two?
well, there's a folder associated with each of the usernames. So the cookies in theory are separate. When I'm really paranoid, I use 2 separate browsers. So I never go to my pseudo account from my primary browser. I only go through another one. Now, in theory, can they get the data? You know, yeah, but it's going to take a whole lot more work, and they have to know that that's what I'm doing. But part of it is also a decision about what we do online. So I'm okay booking a vaccination online. For example, if I had a prescription for heart medicine, I would use a VPN, I would use a secure browser, and I would in no way allow that information to get out, at least as much as I could. And in fact, I can't remember the last time I actually had a prescription, but that's my advice. unless you're using a VPN, unless you're using a secure browser, don't do it. I've also been known to use this. Because at that point, they have no way of tracking me directly. But we're back to the basics. What you don't know can hurt you. What you don't know can be used against you. If you go back to a conversation we had from day one, the fundamental problem is that intellectually, we're still back in the 17th century. Privacy is a 21st century problem. Right? As long as there's a breach, we have no way of fixing the problem, let alone understanding the problem. So if I think about most of the people I know, and if I were to raise the question of privacy and start talking about cookies and the different kinds of cookies, most of them would not be able to wrap their head around it. And even if we don't think in terms of the problem with cookies, with the rise of social media, we think we're having a conversation with friends, but we aren't. So the point that I'm making is that social media has been responsible for a redefinition of a number of words. Friend does not mean what it meant 30 years ago. Private doesn't mean what it meant 30 years ago. People are routinely sharing on Facebook the kind of personal information that 50 years ago would never have been said to anyone but their closest friends. Never. And we do it all the time, and we do it without thinking. And that's where it becomes so incredibly dangerous. We have no clue. So you can just as easily argue in a court of law. If you go back to the bad 1950s way of dealing with a woman who's been raped, the argument would have been, what were you wearing? And tell us about your sexual history. Well, how can you object to somebody using something you say on Facebook in public or to hurt you when you don't understand the fact that Facebook is not private? It's not personal, and there is no privacy. Not only is your right to privacy contingent on our political structure continuing to allow it to exist, but Facebook is not bound by the right to privacy as we understand it as a nation. Because when you sign up, you give it up. You don't have a leg to stand on. And now perhaps you're beginning to see how severe the problem is. If you decline a user agreement, the application terminates. You could argue that that's coercive. I don't know if it'll stand up in court. The last point I want to make we've talked about this in a couple of my classes. The attitude is, in Latin, it's caveat emptor. In English, it's let the buyer beware. And it means it is up to you to figure out the risks of using this product. So up until the end of the 1960s, if this is a pickup truck, here's the engine, here's the cab. The gas tank was behind the front seat. So if you were hit from the side, if that gas tank ruptured, you'd go up in flames. And the response of the auto industry was, you should know better. Really? Are people really able to know that, to infer that? Hmm. Do you see the point? Yes, no?
Yes.
Okay. So next week, when we revisit some of these issues, we want to keep all of this analysis in mind. It's considerably more complex and considerably more difficult to sort out than we're inclined to believe. Any other questions? All right, people. On that note, have a great night. I will get the lecture up hopefully by tomorrow night. As always, it's great to talk to you. Take care.
Thank you,
Thank
you
you.
too.